Really happy to be talking about a decade of cinema that's probably become the most talked about, the most enjoyable and enjoyed decade of Hindi cinema. And there's a reason for that. And as uh, Haki has been in the space of archiving and conservation of heritage, I think one of the important aspects that we do miss out on, we don't consider it important enough, is that of conserving our cinematic heritage, which we are not very good at, as facts and figures will show. Barely 1% of our early films have survived. We don't have. I know this is, for example, this is the 100th anniversary of two legendary figures of Indian cinema, Tapan Sinha and his wife Arundhati Devi, and most of their films are not available in good prints anywhere. So and there's so little information available on cinema, because primarily I think and particularly uh, the cinema that the 70s epitomized. The cinema that was fun, that was song and dance. Of course, there were a variety of cinemas. We'll come to that in the 70s, but primarily it was a cinema that is characterized as fun and, Naach Gana wala cinema. And that probably is this a bit of snobbery there about, okay, this is mindless entertainment. This is not worth talking about or preserving, and which is sad. I was speaking to a legendary actress recently, Sharmila Tagore, who has been an actor with probably the greatest Indian filmmaker, Satyajit Ray. She has acted in 6 films with Ray, but she herself says that, but for the fact that I was part of Kashmir Ki Kali and uh, An Evening in Paris, and but for those songs, I don't think I would have had the pan-Indian and even the identity in the world, the world outside India, the Indians living outside India, all of them remember Sharmila Tagore primarily for the songs in the films that she was part of. She has some terrific roles in Hindi cinema, and of course her films with Ray are classics, but those are not what makes her uh, Sharmila Tagore. She herself agrees to that. So I think there's a case for conservation or preservation or bringing together information about cinema, particularly mainstream cinema. We do have good academic studies of cinema that is considered serious. The Adur Gopalakrishnans and the Satyajit Rays. We have got enough books around them, but so one of my major reasons of working on this was the fact that the 70s, the Hindi cinema of the 70s is like unlike any other cinema anywhere probably in the world. You know, the way so many things came together to make this decade makes the 70s, the Hindi cinema of the 70s, a unique uh, creature, and a creature of many parts. So we'll start with that. We'll, on that note, so uh, one of the things is that no decades actually exists in isolation. If we could have the first slide that I had prepared, no decade exists in isolation. The 70s were informed by the films of the 60s and were to play a significant part in the cinema of the 80s. Uh, when we got started on this project on bringing together, I had initially thought of putting a book together on the 70s myself, right. My perception of the cinema of the 70s, though I grew up in the 80s and I'd missed the 70s. I was not part of the 70s. I was not part of the crowds that thronged the cinema halls of the time. But I thought I'll bring it together. And then it turned out that there are so many aspects of the decade that for anybody, for me to do it, it'll probably take another 10 years, and I just thought that it needed somebody to put that together. That's when I got in touch with my co-editor, and of course, uh, we just started thinking of aspects. So this book actually brings together over 40 essays on various aspects of cinema, be it the journalism of the era. It was the film journalism of the era was entirely crazy, the kind of journalism we had. The fashion of the films of that decade are still, fashion keeps coming back. And now, all of those things, the music of the era, everything that we call retro at this point of time is what we refer to of the 70s. So, but the 70s were sort of, they came together in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s. For almost 2 decades in the 50s and 60s, these people, the Devanand, Dilip Kumar, Raj Kapoor, they ruled the roost, like they were the stars of and they kind of dominated uh, entertainment Hindi cinema totally. There was absolutely nobody else, a director like Guru Dutt, or with his Sahib Bibi Gulam and all, were operating almost, like in the margins of these three people. These three people sort of made everything worth watching, or define entertainment of that. But in the 60s, things started to change. And if we could have the next slide, I'll probably elaborate on that. Uh, so with the 60s came the first inkling that things were changing, and that came through uh, Shami Kapoor. What we see as the angry young man in the 70s, the guy who is always sort of going against the system. I think it first happened with in the 60s with Shami Kapoor. He was unlike any of the heroes of the time. He was unlike the Devanand, or Dilip Kumar, or Raj Kapoor. This he with that one clarion call of Yahoo in Jangli, he sort of broke through. Okay, I'll the one difference with Amitabh Bachchan's Angry Young Man was that this he was more of a fun-loving guy, and the 60s were actually an era where cinema had become very escapist. There was none of the films, most of the films of this after the 1950s, where we had this in the first flush of independence, we had a lot of uh, meaningful cinema, even in the mainstream, even in the box office context. We had films that spoke about nation building, like Avara and Sri 420 and Mother India, and all of that came together. But by the end of the 50s, there was some discontent coming in. Jine Naaz Hai, Hind Par Wo Kahan Hai, in Pyasa, and Fir Fir Subah Hogi, sort of the cynicism started. But in the 60s, all that changed, and there was a reason why that changed, because India faced a couple of wars. There were a number of, droughts and all of that. In the mid 60s, for the first time, uh, political parties started breaking up the concentration of power by in the hands of the Congress started to break up. There were language rights and all of that. So, and Hindi cinema at that point of time did not know how to deal with it. There was too much of depression in the country to say, and they went escapist. So if you will see in the 60s, films went to hill stations. All of them, like a majority of the films went to the hill stations to sort of have their stories, because and very few of them were really connected with what was happening in the country as a whole. They very rarely reflected. But as I said, like Shami Kapoor, uh, changes were taking place for the first time in the 60s, the mid 60s. After the mid 60s, women were getting an agency. So when you hear Asha Parekh sing, Aja Aja Main Hu Pyar Tera, it's a sort of, come, it's a come hither song, which wasn't a heroine earlier than that wouldn't have been singing that song. Or Sharmila Tagore, in An Evening in Paris in her bikini and all of that. So they were trying to break through, and what was also happening, if we come to the next slide, is that uh the three people who you must forgive me, my voice, I've had a very bad cold and so I'm breaking up. The three people who had dominated 20 years, the 50s and the 60s, came up with their biggest flaws right at the cusp of the 70s. 69 70 mein Devanand delivered a dud like Prem Pujari. Raj Kapoor almost went bankrupt with Mera Naam Joker, and Dilip Kumar had, even a film with music by Naushad, directed by Gardar, with this one, Wahida Rahman as a star. The film Dil Diya Dar Diya bombed. So, and by the end of the 60s, Shammi Kapoor, due to some personal reasons, had sort of stopped acting in films, had bloated up to 1966. He had Teesri Manzil, which again was a harbinger of what was going to happen in the 70s in terms of music. But with these three icons almost reaching the dead end of their career, and Shammi Kapoor no longer the kind of hero that he used to be in the first half of the 60s, things were ready for a change. If we can go to the next, the flops of the this time sort of paved the way for what was to come in the 70s. So if you could go to the next slide, I'll just bring that in. So 1969 is, as a friend of mine and a contributor in this volume, um, Balaji Vittal, a national award winner, winning author. We have worked together. As he pointed out, 1969 is the year that led to what we call the 1970s of Hindi cinema. And like we had the man on the in the West, we had the Man on the Moon, we had Led Zeppelin with their first album, we had the Beatles with their last act together, and around that same time, Dylan had sung around a few years here and there had sung. The times were changing, and if the times were changing in the West, it was definitely changing in the East with in India with Rajesh Khanna, who delivered Aradhana and changed the landscape of Hindi cinema, influenced the landscape of Hindi cinema for the next few years. If we so the 69 is a very 69 also happens to be a year that is influential in terms of what we saw in the 70s. This was the year when uh, three cult classics of alternatives, the other cinema, the offbeat, the art house cinema. Mrinal Sen directed Bhuvan Shom. Uh, uh, Basu Chatterjee directed Sara Akash, and Mani Kaul directed Uski Roti. These three films were all shot by one cinematographer, K.K. Mahajan, and all of them did well in the limited circuits of the time and paved the way for what was to be the art house alternative cinema that we saw in the 70s. So 69 was, and KK Mahajan was a product of the FTII, the Film and Television Institute of India. Had started in 62. By 66, the first batches were coming out, and by the end of the decade, 69 70, they were starting to work in mainstream cinema, and that would sort of influence the look and feel and the art and the aesthetics of Hindi cinema of the 70s. So against that backdrop, with the coming of Rajesh Khanna and uh, these factors, the times were actually changing, as Dylan said. If we could go to the next slide. Okay, now the 70s, to understand the cinema of the 70s, the mainstream cinema of the 70s, or in fact, all three cinemas of the 70s, which I'll come to later. one needs to get a sense of the political social situation in India. 25 years, almost 25 years into independence, we were beginning to realize that independence, freedom was not what it was meant, what it was made out to be. All the dreams like, when in 57, 58, साहिर हैड सेठ जिन्हें नाज है हिंद पर वो कहाँ है, या ये दुनिया अगर मिल भी जाए तो क्या है, his expression of frustration that was portrayed in प्यासा by that, और फिर सुबह होगी वो सुबह कभी तो आएगी, the kind of, सोने को घर नहीं है, रहने को घर नहीं है, चीनो अरब हमारा, that kind of satire where we are not able to provide our people with the basic necessities that first came into our cinema in the late 50s, when the dream of independence, the freedom, the dream of our freedom was starting to just sour a bit, and which we had pushed away in the 60s through our escapist cinema, now made a comeback with the 70s. As in the aftermath, if you could go to the next slide while I talk, in 71 we had the Bangladesh, we had the war leading to the liberation of Bangladesh. That created a huge social unrest, in particularly in certain pockets of India where refugees came into the country in huge numbers. 70s also, the early 70s also started, for the first time political corruption became a reality in India. Till that time, you wouldn't have politicians seen as corrupt at all. But now that has started. General corruption also entered the landscape, and unemployment, unrest, general social unrest, rising prices. All of this came together to sort of give us a new cinema, which led to the rise of uh, the angry young man, the angry cinema that came to be, associated majorly with Amitabh Bachchan post 1973. But in the first 3 or 4 decades, it was still Rajesh Khanna with his romantic image, with his song, and with his beautiful, beautiful songs in films like Aradhana and Amar Prem, who sort of. But somewhere down the line, that lily white smile, that the audience had started feeling that things were not, there was nothing actually to smile about. There were more things in the world that wanted to think about, and the kind of romance that Rajesh Khanna his films were propagating through the music. So in so the 70s became, and with the influx of the people from FTII, the students who had graduated out of the Film Institute came in with a lot of aesthetics from the West. They were exposed to the films of the West, the realism of the films of the West, and that had a major impact not only on the art house cinema that Shyam Benegal would pioneer with Ankur, but also on the mainstream cinema. If you look at the cinema of written by Salim Javed, with the with the Film Institute guys came a whole new crop of directors who were not afraid to junk what the 60s were dishing out. So all of that escapism, this was the art house movement that came, of course, in other states, like, Adur had been making films. Satyajit Ray had literally traveled from 55 Pothir Panchali. By the time you're talking 70, Ray was actually on a downward. His best works were almost behind him, barring a couple of more. But then Hindi cinema came of age in the Hindi alternative cinema came of age in the 70s with the influx of talent from the FTII. You know, Mrinal Sen, who was known, who's the enfant terrible of Bengali cinema, who had pioneered so many different forms in Bengali cinema, and so he made a mark in 69, 70, 71 with a couple of Bengali films that sort of became cults because of the way, in a interview and Calcutta 71, he kind of gave us the kind of cinema that, the kind of uh, immediate cinema that we didn't have, so he often came unscripted. So a lot of Calcutta 71 or interview was like he would just give his actors and the situation, and uh, uh, they were free to improvise. So that kind of cinema came into the picture with Mrinal Sen. Bhuvan Shom sort of made it possible. Films like Bhuvan Shom and Uski Roti, and to an extent Sara Akash, made the success of these films actually made it possible for filmmakers in Hindi cinema. Just imagine, Bhuvan Shom is a Hindi film whose main star is Utpal Dutt. And, so it was unthinkable in the 60s. It was unthinkable that a film with just Utpal Dutt as the main star and a story like that would actually be made. But it was not only made, it became one of the biggest successes of commercial successes of Hindi cinema. So much so that there's this wonderful story of Mrinal Sen hailing a taxi in Bombay and asking the taxi driver to take him to his destination. And the taxi driver sees a poster of Bhuvan Shom and starting to talk about it. And Mrinal Sen asks the taxi driver, "Aapne dekhi hai picture?" एंड इट एक्चुअली, हाँ, उसमें लवली लवली उसमें बहुत अच्छे बतख के सीन्स है, लवली सीन्स इन्वॉल्विंग ducks and birds and all, बहुत अच्छे पंछियां हैं. So Mrinal Sen was sort of, like, okay, this man has taken in that element, like some really lovely sequences of outdoor sequences with birds he has taken in, but it was making us, and he had shown the way. So, and this art house cinema would sort of reach its would sort of get its place with Sham Benegal, in while of course Mani Kaul and Kumar Shani made a kind of cinema that was very, very theoretical, in the sense that they adhered to a certain aesthetic which was probably not very viewer friendly. So you would have a sequence where a man is walking on in a scene, walking towards, and that shot is held for minutes on end, but there is a certain music, there's a certain rhythm to it, but then it requires a certain uh, awareness of cinema aesthetics to, so which a filmmaker like Sham Benegal did away with, while remaining rooted to that. If you can go to the next thing while I talk about Sham Benegal, and the kind of next slide, if we could go to. So, Sham Benegal talked about real India. If you look at Ankur, it was revolutionary. At that point of time, there had not been a film which addressed patriarchy in the language of the people it depicted. So the language also, there's the Deccani language was infused into the script in Ankur. It didn't have to be the proper chaste Urdu Hindustani that had characterized cinema, and again, a totally new uh, way of looking at cinema. Of course, they did away with the song and the dance, which many of these, like right from Manikol, and they sort of saw, unless the musical is a different concept. In the West, the musical means entirely different. In the Hindi cinema, for all its 6 songs in a film, are not musicals in the sense that the musical is defined in the West. But so what Shambenegal and the filmmakers, and in that era, most of the films of this particular genre, the art house cinema, was defined by Shambenegal. It's only in the 80s that his assistants and cinematographers like Govind Nilani and made his first films, Ankush and Akrosh, um, Aghat, Akrosh and Aghat, and then Saeed Akhtar Mirza came with his brand of very, very angry protagonist in Albert Pinto. But it was Sham Benegal who paved the road with first Ankur, which sort of was revolutionary for the way it cast total unknowns, like Shabana Azmi making her debut in that film, Anant Nag, and that final sequence where Anant, the character played by Anant Nag, insults, and so the high upper caste landlord gets into a sexual relationship with this lower caste woman, and has the best of both worlds. But when the upper caste man actually insults the husband of this woman, the woman sort of rises in a very symbolic revolt, and that final scene is sort of uh, was angry cinema at its best. But while while Sham Benegal was perfecting this, and for the next 4 years, Sham Benegal, and there are a couple of essays on Sham Benegal in this book, which you should. Asim Chabra's essay on uh, the influence of Sham Benegal, and Professor Amitav Kumar's essay on Nishant, actually the kind of influence these films had. And he created what is probably the first uh, group of actors. He always had the same group ensemble cast of you know the Nasiruddin Shahs and Om Puris and Smita Patils and Shabana Azmi, Kulbhushan Kharbanda, and these Mohan Agashe, Anant Nag. So these people would play the primary roles in all these films. Ankur, followed by Nishant, then Manthan. Recently we had Manthan releasing in a new, in a restored version, and watching the film, it's so immediate, even 50 years after it was made. The probably the first crowd-funded film. The 70s actually paved the way for crowdfunding of films. Also, if you look at Manthan and the way it was made, with inputs, with over 5 lakh farmers of the Gujarat cooperative putting in 2 rupees each, and Sham Benegal finding his the 10 lakh rupees he needed. So, in films like Manthan and Mandi, and Nishant, and Bhumika, he created a whole different world. Even when the music, it's not that he did away with the music totally. His We'll come to the music of the decade a little later, but Shambhanig, the way he used music was entirely different. A film like Manthan has a song by Preeti Sagar, Mara Gaon Katha Pare, which is as much of a hit, as much of an influential song as, say, Edam Marodam, which came in the 70s. But the way it is used, the way he incorporated songs in the narrative, or for example in Bhumika, which is the story of a Marathi actress, and so he had to include songs that were being shot on the actress when the films were being shot on. So it was a very different way of including songs, and realistic way of incorporating songs into the narrative. But at the same time, what while this new alternative cinema was, the art house cinema was uh, sort of coming into its own and flourishing with the likes of uh, Sham Benegal. At the other extreme, there was the mainstream cinema. What this Sham Benegal's mode of filmmaking also gave was what we call the middle of the road cinemas, that a cinema that existed somewhere between the uh, over the top aesthetics of mainstream cinema, जहाँ पे everything is up at a, everything is narrated at a slightly higher volume of, so every dialogues are heavy, the songs are there are what came to be called the item numbers, where so every film had every major film had those kind of numbers. uh, on the one hand you had that, and on the other hand you had the very very restrained aesthetic of the Sham Benegal film of school of uh, offbeat the offbeat art house cinema. In between there was this crop of filmmakers, and I think what we say of filmmakers like Shujit Sarkar and Anurag Kashyap and Dibakar Banerjee, and you know what you know the kind of films that we have seen in the last 10-15 years, actually from these filmmakers owes itself to filmmakers like Gulzar, Rishikesh Mukherjee, Basu Chatterjee, and Basu Bhattacharya. What they did was they adapted cinema to their own sensibilities. They said, okay, this mainstream ka jo sensibility hai, it's a little alien to our sensibilities, which is a notch more believable. At the same time, they were in love with the music that characterized mainstream cinema. They didn't let go of the music, so they created a beautiful amalgamation of these two uh, uh, different streams of cinema. So you had a Parichay, which is telling a very different, which is telling a very uh, uh, what do you call it? Very simple story. Like the story is as simple as any of the blockbusters, but the aesthetic of it. He did not let go of the music. So here, the hero and the heroine, they're all lip syncing to a song, so that unrealism is there, but they are doing it in a very different. At the same time, when he makes a koshish, he goes an entirely different. It's almost as realistic in the depiction of the deaf and mute couple as a Sham Benegal would probably make if you were to make the film. So at the same time, a filmmaker like Rishikesh Mukherjee or even Basu Chatterjee, I'll come to both of them independently. Rishikesh Mukherjee, in fact, perfected the art of getting the big stars. Just look at the stars who worked with him. Amitabh Bachchan, Rajesh Khanna, Dharmendra, Shatrughan Sinha, Vinod Khanna, all of them the big stars of the 70s. They were the stars who were Dharmendra. They were the stars who were making the Yado Ki Barats and the Sholays, uh, 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 the Yado Ki Barats, the Sholays, the Dons, and the Amar Akbar Anthony's. ये सब बना रहे थे. But he got these stars and said, okay, now you don't know anything. Get rid of all your starry airs. I'll give you the roles that I think you should play. So he gave Rajesh Khanna Anand and Namakharam and Bawarchi. So, he was redefining the stardom of superstars. He gave Amitabh Bachchan Anand, जिसमें Babu Moshaye is still 51 years after, is still uh, one of his most respected roles. Namak Haram, which actually, people call Zanjeer the birth of the angry young man. But if you actually look at Rishikesh Mukherjee's films, I think nobody did the angry young man with Amitabh Bachchan as well as he did. Look at his role in Anand. Babu Moshai is a very, very angry young man, cynical, angry, not doesn't want to smile with anybody, doesn't see any reason to smile. Namak Haram, of course, is the film that established him just in the wake of Zanjeer, established Amitabh Bachchan as the angry young man and dethroned Rajesh Khanna. Then you have a film like Alap. Again, if you look at the character Amitabh Bachchan plays in that role, in what was his biggest flop, so imagine the daring of this director who says, Amitabh Bachchan ko main बंदूक नहीं दूंगा, अमिताभ बच्चन को मैं डिशुम डिशुम नहीं दूंगा, अमिताभ बच्चन के हाथों में आई जस्ट गिव अ सितार, ही विल प्ले अ सितार, ही विल प्ले अ क्लासिकल musician who gets a life with this group of, Ektabaev and her family, and sort of finds relation. And he is angry because his father is belongs to that established class, which is sort of destroying a certain structure that existed, a certain uh, world that exists, which Alap was a sort of goodbye to, so here was Rishikesh Mukherjee, who was making the kind of films which look at what he did with Dharmendra. You talk of Dharmendra and you talk of Kutte Kamine Main Tera Khoon Pee Jaunga. And here he is, Rishikesh Mukherjee, giving Dharmendra a Satya Kam in 69, where Dharmendra is this utterly honest officer who has no place in the current in the India that we have. And then in 75, he gives Dharmendra, in the same year that Dharmendra and Amitabh Bachchan were burning and killing people in Sholay, he gave Dharmendra and Amitabh Bachchan the funniest of roles in Chupke Chupke. You know, what a departure between, 75, you see Sholay, you see Chupke Chupke. So this was a guy who was saying, I will use stars, I will give them the kind of roles I think they should do. And each one of them actually came to, look at Mili, Amitabh Bachchan's performance in that. It's, if you look at Mili, it's a reworking of Anand. Replace Rajesh Khanna with Jaya Bhaduri, and you have more or less. Amitabh Bachchan plays again a very, very angry role in that. So he was taking elements already existing in the mainstream cinema and giving it his own, uh, uh, what do you call a tadka sort of, so he's making it, and some of the greatest films of that era with music, just imagine the songs of Anand. And so he also made use of songs like Gulzar Saab did in all his films. Songs were an integral part of, he did not let go of songs. And the third part of that, the third point of this troika was Basu Chatterjee, who in 1974, again, 1974 is a seminal year. We are in 50 years from that, from the year today. And 1974, Basu Chatterjee, after his early success in Uski Roti, came out with Rajinigandha and rewrote the rules of filmmaking at that point of time. Imagine, just two characters. The protagonist, played by Amol Palekar, the woman played by Vidya Sinha, and her ex-lover, and the agency it gave to Vidya Sinha, where she is in love with this with the character played by Amol Palekar, who is totally, there's this wonderful scene where she is dressed up in a sari and all of that, and she wants Amol Palekar to sort of tell her that she's looking beautiful, but he's totally in his own office ke gappe kar raha hai and all of that. They're walking, and then she has to ask him कि ये साड़ी कैसी है, and then he just says अच्छी है, बैंगनी है, as if. And in contrast, when she comes to Bombay for a job, to take up a job, she meets her ex-flame, and there is this thing and this lovely lovely song, कई बार यूं ही देखा है ये जो मन की सीमा रेखा है. you know Only a director who had the visuals of, it is impossible to, you have to watch this song to see what it does, in how it depicts the mind of a woman, and how much, in an era where women were supposed to be sort of this Sati Savitri, mera pati mera Parmeshwar hai, and all of that. Most of the cinema was like that. And here was a guy who was making a film with this character, with this lady who was considering, okay, is my ex-flame. They had fallen out, but now she was wondering, and that whole thing about, do do I have to be true to the guy I have left behind? Or is Dinesh Thakur, the character, the ex-Flame character, is he the right guy? Because he's so much more involved in what she is as a woman than Amol Palekar is. So all that came into thing with Basu Chatterjee, who sort of set a sort of trend with films like Chitchor, again Amol Palekar, and in like if the mainstream cinema had Amitabh Bachchan as its main protagonist, Basu Chatterjee gave the other character which became who became you know um, so important in that 70s landscape, the everyman character of Amol Palekar, like films like Chitchor, Choti Si Baat, Rajini he was the quintessential everyday man, and it's interesting that with these filmmakers, say a guy like Sanjeev Kumar, and there's a wonderful essay on Sanjeev Kumar also in this book. A guy like Sanjeev Kumar, just imagine the hero material of the 50s and 60s, Sare Punjabi, good looking, complexion, white and red complexion, the Rajesh Khannas, the Shammi Kapoors, the Raj Kapoor, Devanand, and Vinod Khanna and Dharmendra with their bodies. And here is Sanjeev Kumar with his pot belly. And Gulzar made with his almost, I think, 14 films together they did, and made a different star of Sanjeev Kumar. And here was a guy who was playing, at the same point of time, playing the father-in-law to Jaya Bahaduri, the lover to Jaya Bahaduri, the father to Jaya Bahaduri in the same time. So, these filmmakers between Basu Chatterjee and Rishikesh Mukherjee and Gulzar, Basu Bhattacharya, probably in his trilogy of marriage films, Anubhav, Avishkar, and Griha Pravesh. We forget uh, how how beautifully the first two films, and of course, Griha Pravesh is possibly one of the greatest soundtracks. We don't talk about music of Griha Pravesh when we talk about the music of Hindi films, because somewhere down the line it's got lost. But look at Anubhav, the music of Kanu Roy, and the way Anubhav Avishkar starred Rajesh Khanna in one, and Sharmila Tagore, two mainstream stars in totally deglamorized roles, with some of the loveliest music, and the way they handled the seriousness and the wonderful way they handled the institution of marriage in that trilogy is sort of, which wasn't the case in the mainstream cinema, and which wasn't in the parallel offbeat cinema of Sham Benegal would have gone to another extreme. So this middle of the road cinema is something that came together, is a product of the 70s. They took the best of the mainstream song and dance cinema, and the pared to the bone cinema of Sham Benegal, and made their own kind of cinema. If we could go to the next slide, we'll go on from there to okay. Now, since cinema was changing, the face and like cinema is a director's medium, but it is the hero and the heroine which who actually portray what the director has in mind. So with the change in the kind of cinema, the nature of the hero and the heroine also changed. If you look at the films of the 60s, you had people like Rajendra Kumar and Biswajit and Guru Dutt and all, who were, some Manoj Kumar, who were, of course, Manoj Kumar, again, wonderful essay on Manoj Kumar also, because from the 60s, he was one star who made it in a different avatar in the 70s. And I'll talk about how that happened. In the 60s, Rajendra Kumar, Manoj Kumar were all sort of VP heroes, They would break into tears at the drop of a hat, and all these Muslim socials that they had, Mehboob Ki Mehendi, and, all of that, or Patthar Ke Sanam. So uh, you had a hero who was very quick to tears. the 70s broke that mold. Of course, it began with a guy who was quick to tears. Rajesh Khanna, of course, was, you know, probably the most woman-like, the most heroine-like in all his films. It says something of that era, that if you look at the films of Rajesh Khanna, all of them are they ran in the name of Rajesh Khanna because he became the kind of star, but it was the women in the film who was calling the shots. Aradhana had a Sharmila Tagore in probably the role of her lifetime in terms of the commercial cinema. Like there's been an Anupama, and there was going to be a Namkeen, which had her in very, very, or a Mosam, which had her in very different. But in mainstream cinema, Aradhana was as much Sharmila Tagore's role, and she had the guts to actually play mother to Rajesh Khanna. She was just 25 at that point of time. Imagine in a industry which stereotyped you to a certain role. Uh, Immediately, she had the guts to play a mother to Rajesh Khanna. Look at Amar Prem. Again, a quintessential, uh, mm, you know, uh, 70s ka psychological hero, like who has this very existentialist crisis. But again, it is driven by the character of the Tawayaf, played by Sharmila Tagore. And it's basically her relationship with her adopted son, which is the, which Rajesh Khanna, the actor, the hero, actually providing a foil to that main narrative. Look at Kati Patang. It is Asha Parekh's story. It is not Rajesh Khanna's story. Kati Patang is Asha Parekh's story. So there was this whole new heroine that was coming into play. And that heroine would find its uh, its explosion, or kind of would burst forth with the character of Janice in uh, Hare Rama, Hare Krishna. So here was for the first time, you know, a mainstream heroine actually dressed in Western clothes she could pull off without feeling an iota of embarrassment about the way she looked. She was smoking, she was drinking, she was, she was living in a haze of drugs with Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, and uh, absolutely rewrote what the Hindi. Nobody, not even Sharmila Tagore or any of Asha Parekh, who had actually, between Asha Parekh and Sharmila Tagore, brought in this modern Western influence into the heroine, but nobody did it as half as well as Zeenat Aman did in a string of films. Look at, like she was unapologetic about the way she was in Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, in Yado Ki Bharat. Again, a very, very Western. She obviously later, in the industry, she also had to fall in line. But you remember her more for the way, the elan, the chushpa with which she carried of the Western influence, brought in the Western influence. And in a film like Diwar, if you see this one particular scene where Amitabh Bachchan and Parveen Babi are on a bed and both of them are smoking, it's a scene that is probably a first in Hindi cinema. You know, uh, you it's very apparent. Of course, uh, we had not progressed to the stage where we could show a love making scene, but in the way it is shown, you can make out that these two people have made love, and they're smoking cigarettes together on the bed. It couldn't have been more. Of course, the end was, the woman had to die. You could argue with that this was comeuppance for the kind of life she lived, but all of that is uh, an afterthought. The thing was, there was this character that was being written. I've already spoken about the woman that Vidya Sinha epitomized, the middle class heroine. You know, the heroine who would go to work, the woman who would be an executive assistant. In a film like Choti Si Baat, you had that whole office thing. So for the first time, women were actually breaking out into uh, the workspace. If you look at Rakhi, there's a essay that I have in this book on Rakhi. You know, you actually had, again, 1974, one of the classics of Indian cinema, not just Hindi cinema, 27 Down, Rakhi, a memorable role. It's 50 years now. And again, a character that is working, that has more agency than the guy's character in that film. Tapasya, where she's the sole bread earner. Of course, it plays on the sacrificial, the Mother India variety of woman that Hindi cinema has always eulogized. But still, there was this character, or Dusra Admi, a daring film for its time, which actually showed uh, an elderly man and a younger woman, the elderly woman and a younger man. The elderly woman sees in the younger man her dead lover, sort of there's a resemblance, and there's this whole thing, and the young man is already married to somebody else, and so all of this comes together in this, and she's a boss of a advertising agencies. All of that is coming together in these characters. Of course, she would go on to become a traditional housewife in Kabhi Kabhi and films like that. But Rakhi would also epitomize a very strong counterpoint to the hero of Amitabh Bachchan. When Amitabh Bachchan the uh, ruled the decade, there were no heroines who had any sort of meaningful roles opposite him, barring Rakhi. She was always, be it a small role in Trishul, वो टक्कर वाला role था, be it that role, again a small role in Kala Patthar, टक्कर वाला role था, be it कभी कभी it was a role that so there was this, all the women were coming into their own, and this was helped by the alternative cinema, the offbeat, the parallel cinema of Sham Benegal, which gave us um, actors like Shabana Azmi and Smita Patil. For the first time, it actually became possible to uh, think of beauty not in the usual construct of Hindi cinema कि अच्छा वो गोरी चिट्टी होनी चाहिए नहीं, so Shabana Azmi could be as impactful. She may not be the she may not be the Mm, she may not be a beauty like Rakhi, but when it came to the character, she could, outrun anybody. Or a Smita Patil, those dark eyes, that's the way she looked at you. Just have a look at the poster of Manthan. Anyone, if you of those who are joined in, she is mesmerizing. That those eyes could do anything. At the same time, there was this wonderful experimentation that was happening with women characters, that a small time actor like Rehana Sultan, briefly, she wasn't a big star, but first in Dastak, in a film in Dastak called Dastak, which actually showed uh you know the effects of prostitution, like she's come to a house where there used to be a prostitute, and now people drop in thinking it's the house of a prostitute, and what that does to that character, Rehana Sultan, and then Rehana Sultan's breakthrough in Chetana, like this 70s was, like if you, there's this brilliant, if we can go to the next slide, I think it's there in the next slide. Mm, so yes, as we said, the sequence in the we have this uh, we have Dam Maro Dam with Zeenat Aman. Just look at her poster. We have Parvin Babi in that sequence on the bed in Diwar. We have a Rajnigandha. We have Shabana Azmi in Ankur, and we have Chetana. We have 27 Down. You actually have to watch this film to realize what agency the character has. This is fifth. You know, this is the 50th year of three of our greatest characters in Hindi cinema, greatest woman characters in Hindi cinema. 27 Down with Rakhi, uh, uh, Rajnigandha with Vidya Sinha, and Shabana Azmi with Ankur. Can you imagine all of them? And then there was Chetana. I couldn't get the other poster, the bolder poster, which sort of revolutionized, where she's standing. She plays a prostitute in this film, and one who is totally for the first time. Otherwise, kya hota hai? You give a you get a woman to play a prostitute, like even in Amar Prem, a terrific film. But there is always this thing, acha bichari hai, circumstances se ye ban gayi hai, and there is this great man who is willing to accept her. Chetna totally overturned that. Here was this heroine who says, I am like this only. Take it or leave it. I'll smoke, I drink, I sleep around, I'm a prostitute. And there is this man played by Anil Dhawan who is always trying to who initially tries to put her on a pedestal. Devi hai. So it just, Chetna sort of said, what bullshit is this Devi image of the woman? A woman who exercises her uh, right to her body in the way she wants to, is as much. If you are going to call a woman a Devi, she is as much. And Nandini Ramnath has this brilliant essay here, which talks about all these, marginal women in cinema of that time. The characters played by Aruna Irani, for example, in Millie. What a terrific! She's a secretary she stays in a multi-story building, and there is this some scandal associated with her. She has this very voluptuous dresses that she is, and has this wonderful conversation where she's almost exciting the hero to a certain yeah. So, and then there is this Chetna character here. Then there's this film called Ridiculous Film, but again, what a character, Bindu's character uh, in a film called Havas, where it's a takeoff on Graduate, of course, Dustin Hoffman's film. But there is this character who is making who wants to make out with her daughter's fiance, and quite unapologetic about it. So all of this was happening in the 70s. So if you look at liberated and women who are doing a lot, and imagine in the 90s, 95 ke aspas aake, we were having such sterile women characters as in DDLJ, Dilwale Dulhania, and Hum Ke Hain Kaun. Women who were just waiting for their Princess Charming to come and take them off on a, they didn't work. They just looked good and talked about marriage and all of that. This was 90s. In the mid 90s and after, we were having films like that. Jabki 70s had given us these women, the 27 Down, the Rajini Gandha, the Ankur, the Chetna, the Diwar, the Hare Rama, Hare Krishna. So that is one aspect of the 70s that I wanted to talk about. The other aspect is, of course, if you can go to the next slide, and we'll have to take a call probably. With the change in cinema also came with the change in cinema also came, if we could go, the change in the villain. So all of a sudden, the 70s became the early 70s with their unrest and corruption and unemployment and all became a breeding ground for a new kind of villain. Because Amitabh Bachchan and Dharmendra were the kind of big, or the kind of heroes who could bash anybody up, the villain had to change. In the 50s and 60s, 50s may, given the socio-economic condition of the country, the moneylender, the zamindar were the villains. In the 60s, with the escapist cinema, the character of Pran, who was only after the heroine's wealth, or heroine ko शादी करनी है, heroine से शादी करनी है, उसका property और पैसे हड़पने हैं, वही. But the villain changed in the 70s with the businessman, and with a number of import restrictions coming in. We could not import anything. We were a closed economy. So smuggling was, the rise of Haji Mastan and all of that. And a lot of business houses kind of became associated with these nefarious activities, and which made its way into a character, say the character of Teja in Zanjeer, the character of Ajit again in Yado Ki Barat, who has a facade of a hotel, to run. At the same time, you had Amitabh Bachchan in Diwar. Actually, is an anti-hero. He's not. He's smuggling. He's doing everything that law says is not permissible. So a new villain was sort of developing because of and of course the villain got a boost with a film like Sholay, which is even 50 years after, is probably the greatest villain character we have in today. Sholay, people remember more for the first time. Actually, you had record players coming out with just the dialogues of the film because Amjad Khan made it so memorable. So the whole, with if there was a new woman emerging, there was also a new villain emerging. And all of them, thanks to the writing of people like Salim Javed, all of them had such terrific dialogues. That the writing kind of made, तुम्हारे नजदीक की नजर कमजोर है तेजा, और सारा शहर मुझे लॉयन के नाम से जानता है, and all of that. And so also what happened was the villains of the 50s and 60s would probably reform in the end. They would beg forgiveness, and their villainy was not harmful enough for them. But in the 70s, killing entered, and so the villain had to die a very, very violent death in Yado Ki Barat, which probably is 19 Said Akhtar Mirza Sahab. Actually, when we started off the book, actually said you should encapsulate the decade between 73 and 83, because 73 is Yado Ki Barat, which revolutionized violence in Hindi cinema, and 82 is Arth Satta, which brought in a new kind of violence. So and with Zanjeer and Yado Ki Barat in 73 saw the birth of the character of Vijay, and in 82 you have Vijay Tendulkar writing Arth Satya. So there's a sort of one, and Salim Javed's Vijay character became emblematic of the 70s thing, and there was Vijay Tendulkar towards the end of the decade writing Akrosh and Arth Satya. So the villain, the character of the villain also kind of made a paradigm shift. So if we could, I think we are just running out of time. The one aspect I'd like to move on to is probably the one aspect, the next slide, I think the one on music is probably, this is probably the reason why this decade has stayed uh, with all of us. Everything that we call retro is because of the music of the decade. Even none of you would have probably seen a film called Shalimar, a film starring Dharmendra. At that point of time, a film starring uh, two or three top Hollywood stars. John Saxon and the lead actor of Sound of Music, I forget the name. He was part of the film, and Dharmendra and Zeenat Aman. It was the costliest film, became the costliest flop, the biggest flop of the era. Nobody in this generation will have watched this film, but the music, the moment you say 1 2 cha cha cha, you have you have that generation. Or you say Hum Bewafa Hargiz Na The, or the soundtrack of that film. So it is the music of that era, and I think the music of that era was the man who made that era what it was, is R.D. Burman. Of course, with somebody like Kishore Kumar, the team between R.D. Burman. So 1971, you have the last of that thing in Pakiza, the Naushad, and Chalte, the classic lyrics, and the classic Mujra, Tawaif Ole, the whole thing. It was a blockbuster hit. But at the same time, that same year, you have uh, something that would upset everybody, a whole generation of elders should have, with R.D. Burman going Dam Maro Dam. It was a this. Just imagine the lyrics. दुनिया ने हमको दिया क्या, दुनिया से हमने लिया क्या, हम सबकी परवाह करें क्यों, सबने हमारा किया क्या. The sort of dismissal of everybody, which was 60s. The 60s had seen this kind of thing in the West. the flower power and the protests against Vietnam War and the breaking up of families had happened in the West. Here was this man and this lyrics, this song, Anand Bakshi, saying दुनिया ने हमको दिया क्या दुनिया से हमने लिया क्या हम सबकी परवाह करें क्यों सबने हमारा किया. To hell with everybody. And in the drug induced haze of Dam Marodam, then came Jawani Diwani, again a blockbuster of immense proportions. At the same time, imagine the man has a Hare Rama Krishna, Hare Krishna at one end. The same year, he makes Amar Prem. Again, songs that epitomize a certain, like Chingari Koi Bhadke. Just look at the lyrics of that, of the song, or uh, songs that became idiomatic, the Sita bhi yahan badnaam hui, so in that particular song in Amar Prem. So they were making philosophical statements with their songs in the mainstream framework. By the end of the decade, you had, Amar Akbar Anthony, which was totally, again, one of the films that made redundant all the seriousness that was coming into uh, mm, uh, 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 all the. I'll come to Sai Paranjpe also. Sai Paranjpe was in the 80s, so I've seen that query. I'll come to. She was not the 70s, she came in the 80s. Amar Akbar Anthony revolutionized the mainstream masala. Hindi cinema wouldn't have been anything without it was a different, if Sholay was one thing, Amar Akbar Anthony kind of made Hindi cinema a total entertainment oriented cinema. A song like Dawn, Khai Ke Paan Banaras Wala, or the songs of Mukaddar Ka Sikandar, Kalyanji Anandji was another, or the music of Lakshmikant Perilal right through that decade. Amar Akbar Anthony was Lakshmikant Perilal's song. R.D. Burman had, so, R.D. Burman at one end was making Jawani Diwani and Hare Rama Hare Krishna. At the other end, he was making a film like Andhi with Gulzar. Gulzar came up, so if Anand Bakshi caught the very everyday language of cinema with Acha to hum chalte hain, the words have become idiomatic. We say Acha, we meet somebody, Acha to hum chalte hain. That kind of idiomatic things came into. At the same time, Gulzar gave you Andhi, with its high the quality of lyrics was something entirely different. Amar Akbar Anthony gave you My Name is Anthony Gonzalez with all its crazy lyrics. So all of that was possible and I think one of the greatest losses we have had today, of course, we can actually say that Hindi cinema is more realistic in the sense that we actually don't have characters lip syncing, which is a construct that takes cinema into unreal mode. You actually don't have a 40-piece orchestra behind you, even if you are in love and you want to sing out, you don't sing out and you don't have that. But I think that is a loss that we have had. We don't have a Andhi or a Jawani Diwani or a Amar Akbar Anthony anymore. Of course, the Gangs of Wasseypur and all these films, the Vishal Bhardwaj films, they use music brilliantly. They are absolutely wonderful in the way they incorporate. But I think there was something about the Amar Akbar Anthony and the Hare Rama Hare Krishna, the Dawn and the Andhi, the Amar Prem and Mere Jeevan Sathi, a flop. Mere Jeevan Sathi was started the downfall of Rajesh Khanna. But what songs? They released the songs 2 months before the film was released because it had started to catch on, and the songs are still sung. The film nobody knows about. So and at the other end, even if you look at, this is the mainstream music. At the other end was somebody like Vanraj Bhatia. And one of the big misses in this book is that I don't have an essay on Vanraj Bhatia. I couldn't find somebody who could do justice. Just look at the music of Manthan. I watched it recently in the hall, and that one iktara, or whatever the instrument is that plays Maragav Katha Pare, that one tune sort of brings together every emotion in the film, and only Vanraj Bhatia could do it. And he could actually create something as diverse as that with, something in the 80s. He would go when Sham Benegal made Kaliyug, he would go uh, he would go to make a song like What's Your Problem, very, very now, very immediate. He had that in him too. There was Kanu Roy, whom I mentioned, with who gave the music for Anubhav. Just go and listen to the songs of Geeta Dutt, Mujhe Jana Kaho Meri Ja, in that, Koi Chupke Se Aake. What song? So, you had R.D. Burman burning the floor with Hare Rama Hare Krishna, and Diwani. You had him doing the Andis and the Amar Prems. You had Lakshmikant Pyarelal with Amar Akbar Antony, and also coming up with Sargam Dafli Wale and that wonderful melody. You had Kalyanji Anandji with Pal Pal Dil Ke Paas Tum Rehte Ho, contrasting O Saathi Re and Khai Ke Paan Banaras Wala. And you had Vanraj Bhatia with this. And just look at the, of course, wonderful. Thank you so much. How could I forget Salil Chaudhuri? Probably in terms of the sheer organizing of a composition, the guy who could get a Mozart and make it a Hindi film song. Nobody else. Just look at his songs in Rajnikanda and Choti Si Baat. कई बार यूं ही देखा है, और रजनीगंधा फूल तुम महके मेरे आंगन में. And the kind of lyrics that, we talk of the Anand Bakshis, Majrur Sultanpuri with Yado Ki Barat. Just look at the sheer exuberance of Lekar Hum Diwana Dil, Chura Liya Hai Tumne Jo Dil Ko. All of this was the 70s. At the same time, with Salil Chaudhary came this wonderful lyricist called Yogesh. You know, one of the tragedies of Hindi cinema is that this lyricist is not spoken about in as much as he should be. Rajnigandha, Annadata, Choti Si Baat, Jaane Man Tere Do Nayan is his song, and of lyricists like and a lyricist like uh, Amit Khanna with a film like Swami. He was, like Pal Bhar Mein Ye Kya Ho Gaya, or Yasudas's wonderful Ka Karu Sajni. These are all 70s. Can you imagine what this era gave us in terms of the music? And I think that's the biggest contribution. Of course, the cinema was different. There were three, the era was the era was marked by swinging was marked by a swing from uh, Manmohan Desai at one end making films, and Sham Benegal and Satyajit Ray also made his Shatranj Ke Khiladi in this same decade. So you had that whole contrast. You had Shabana Azmi at one end, and Zeenat Aman at one end, with Jaya Bhaduri and Rakhi in the middle. You had R.D. Varman at one end and Lakshmikant Pyarelal with Vanraj Bhatia and Kanu Roy at one end. You had Anand Bakshi and Majru Sultanpuri at one end, Yogesh and Amit Khanna at one end, with Gulzar in the middle, tying it all together. So it was a decade that swung between all these extremes and made it come together in one wonderful form. So it just is, and I could go on and on. I think each component, the hero of the era, the heroines of the era, the directors of the era, we haven't even spoken about the Prakash Mehras and the Manmohan Desais and the Yash Chopras and the Ramesh Sippis, the Gulzars and Rishikesh Mukherjees. We have had a small, so each component of that, the directors, the contrast of the films, the music of the era, the villains, each could have probably an hour's talk. That is what made the era of the 70s. And that is what actually drove me to think of, how do we, there's an essay on the fashion of the era in this book. There's this essay on the journalism of the era on this book. There are essays on stars like Rajesh Khanna and Sanjeev Kumar in this book. There are essays on Anand Bakshi, on Rakhi, on, there is this essay on the cassettes, because cassettes drove music of the era. For the first time, with the coming of cassettes, the LP records ka pe jo dependence tha, and the elitist thing of having to buy LP records, expensive records, came undone. So, and that drove. So, and there are two lovely essays on the how the audio cassette. There's a mood piece on by Jay Arjun Singh on the audio cassette and his introduction to the cinema of this era, and another by Bobby Singh, where he talks about the whole industry of how this cassette industry came and revolutionized how we watched, how we came to love the era of the 70s, the films of the 70s. On that note, if Verena, if we could, I think we have had enough of me talking.
No, not at all. I think I know everyone would want to go on and on, but we are having to stick to some kind of timing here. So it was really a wonderful talk, and like somebody has already said in the chat box, you're really a walking encyclopedia on. I don't know if it's just this era or the whole of Hindi cinema, but it was really, really entertaining, and the stories were fabulous. I'm just going to quickly go through some of the questions that we've got in. The first one was, does your book have any impacts of regional language on the Hindi cinema of the 70s, like from Marathi, Malayalam cinema, any of the
Yeah,
others?
so we actually, regional cinema gets into a lot of varieties. There's so many languages, but we do have a lovely, wonderful essay. The cinema of the 70s, where the Hindi cinema of the 70s were very popular in the South, where they used to remake this film. So a Mukaddar Ka Sikandar and a Dawn and a Diwar and all of these were remade with stars like Shivaji Ganeshan and Rajinikanth and Kamal Hassan. And there's a wonderful funny story about Amitabh Bachchan riding that bike in Mukaddar Ka Sikandar rote hue aate hain sab, and by the time Shivaji Ganeshan came to play it in the Tamil or Telugu film, Shivaji Ganeshan was nowhere near Amitabh Bachchan's figure, and so he couldn't sit on a motorcycle, so they gave him an Impala to sing the song on. So those kind of, so but that essay talks about how the South was impacted, and how in the 80s the role reversed, where Jitendra and Sridevi made a cottage industry of those Tathaiya films, which were remade into Hindi from the existing South Indian films. So that's so in that we have, but yes, and there are the influences of Bengali cinema. For example, somebody called Amol Palekar, the quintessential Bengali guy. So so that there is that influence. There are essays by there is an essay by on Shatranj Ke Khiladi, which was such an influential film, and Satyajit Ray, of course, had an influence on that era's filmmaking. So yes, it's there, but in passing, it's not so much in detail.
Okay, thank you for that. There's another question about, when you were talking about the women and the heroines, that they were very progressive at that time. So there is a question by Arti who said, why did it sort of reverse and go back to the, you know, like you
So
had
what happened was, there are two things that happened. The 70s ended, and with the 80s, there was this huge social change where there was a huge urbanization that happened. So people moved from uh, villages and rural areas into the cities. That changed the demographic of the city audience, film watching audience. With that came video piracy. So piracy became rampant. So this whole section of audience which patronize this kind of progressive filmmaking, that the Shyam Benegals and the Gulzars and the Rishikesh Mukherjees, who had very realistic characters and progressive views and women characters, they shifted en masse to television. उनके लिए video आ गया. And television also started with, this was the era of the bunyads and the hum logs. So, all of a sudden, Hindi cinema lost a huge audience. And the filmmakers who started making films in the 80s lost sight of, they didn't know what to do. Even a filmmaker like Yash Chopra went on to make a film like Vijay, which had some of the trashiest women characters, because he thought that this is what the audience wants. The audience is coming for these kind of women characters where they're only wearing revealing clothes, and there would be a rape scene and a violence against women scene and all of that. By the time it reached the 90s, another thing happened, which is that, the economy opened up, and with that came a lot of uncertainty where, men were not sure of what was happening. With women entering the workforce in such numbers, the whole demographic change, and this uncertainty went back, got reflected in the films of a Suraj Barjatia or a Karan Johar as very, very conservative, often regressive takes on women. So the
Mm.
Simrans of the world actually did not work, because a whole, and the NRI audiences were became very big in the 90s. They preferred their women stay in the home and manage the kitchen. So
Mm.
that kind of got, so, the progressiveness that a 27 down had, or a Ankur had,
Mm.
was dissipated first in the video piracy and urbanization that we witnessed in the 80s, and then in the 90s with economic liberalization and the conservative mindset that overtook us at that point of time.
Yeah, that sort of makes sense. Yeah. Somebody has asked that what about Sai Paranjpe's impact, but I guess there's only so much you can fit into
Yeah,
one
Sai
question.
Paranjpe actually started, her first film was 1979-80. She was, as I said, all decades are not independent of each other. If the 60s influenced the 70s, the 70s cinema of Rishikesh Mukherjee Gulzar influenced Sai Paranjpe. She made her Sparsh, Katha, Chashme Badur in 80, 81, 82. So it comes
Mm.
in the next, if there's a book on the 80s cinema, Sai Paranjpe would, she takes forward the legacy of that. Of course, that legacy collapsed by the mid 80s, where, this kind of cinema went out of fashion.
Yeah. Well, we're hoping that that book is in progress. And maybe one for every decade, since it was really like, if you look at the comments, there was a really, everyone is like, it was a really insightful, nostalgic, engrossing, all the
Yeah,
adjectives.
and the best thing about the book is that, almost all the contributors, there are 42 contributors, almost all of them, barring about three or four, actually grew up in the 80s. They were not products of the 70s. So they are all of them. I grew up, I watched the 70s films in the mid 80s, when
Yes.
Amitabh Bachchan went into politics, and all of a sudden films dried up in the theaters, and the theaters were releasing old Amitabh Bachchan films. So the
Mm.
Diwars and the Shaktis and all of that started coming, and I started watching. And he filled me with so much anger, I used to come back home all agitated कि मुझे मम्मी के साथ लड़ना है, पापा के साथ लड़ना है, because Amitabh Bachchan was fighting with everybody. And poor parents must have thought, my grandmother actually told my parents that Amitabh Bachchan will, iska dimag khayega Amitabh Bachchan, Yeah. So, but that was the kind, and there was something about watching it on the big screen, as I have said in a
Of
couple of,
course.
like when Amitabh Bachchan in when you watch Kala Patthar on a big screen, and Amitabh Bachchan says, "Dhanna tu to gaya." Just imagine four lines, four words. He is holding that knife and looking into the eyes of the Gunda and saying, "Dhanna tu to gaya." That impact of watching it on the big screen is, I watched the Kala Patthar so many times on the small screen. वो impact ही नहीं आता. I was lucky I watched it in the big screen in the 80s when the films released came on. So, and a lot of these perspectives come into the book, because all of us are talking about looking at the 70s from that perspective.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, watching a film in the cinema, it's made for cinema, so that's the medium you should watch it on. So yeah, watching it on a small screen is never quite as good. But like I said, I hope there's another talk on the 80s, the 90s, and as many as you can.
Absolutely.
We've had a fantastic evening, and thank you all for being there. And do join us next week
Thank you,
for
Prerna, and
our next talk. Thank you
this
very
is
much.
wonderful. This is wonderful. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.